While America's eyes are locked on the burning skies over Iran, something just happened in the Pacific that most people in this country haven't even registered yet. North Korea fired approximately 10 ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan on Saturday, right as the world's attention was fixed on the war ignited by the US-Israel attacks on Iran and Tehran's retaliatory strikes across the region. That is not a coincidence. That is a calculation. And this is exactly the kind of moment that history looks back on and asks, how did everyone miss this? Here is what the mainstream conversation is leaving out. Indo-Pacific based US assets, missile interceptors in South Korea and US Marines in Okinawa are currently redeploying to the Middle East, where Iran's will to fight remains unbroken. Read that again. The very shield America placed between North Korea and its neighbors is quietly being pulled away and repositioned thousands of miles to the west. The redeployments have raised quiet concerns about the US ability to fight a two-front war. Quiet concerns. That phrase alone should tell you something. When military analysts start using the word quiet, what they really mean is this is serious, and nobody in power wants to say it out loud. North Korea's foreign ministry has released statements denouncing the joint US-Israeli attacks on Iran and expressing support for Tehran's new supreme leader. So now we have Pyongyang and Tehran ideologically aligned, both watching Washington stretch itself thin across two theaters of war simultaneously. The provocative move comes amid the rapid expansion of North Korea's nuclear weapons program in recent years, including systems capable of threatening US allies in Asia and long-range missiles that could potentially reach the United States itself. This is not a rogue state rattling cages for attention. This is a nuclear-armed government allied in spirit with America's active wartime enemy, probing the edges of a distracted empire. The question you need to be asking right now is not whether Kim Jong-un is angry. It is whether he and others are beginning to sense that this is the moment Washington is most exposed. Now let's understand what was actually happening in the 10 days leading up to yesterday's missile barrage, because context is everything here, and context is precisely what gets stripped out of the 30-second news bulletin. North Korea fired more than 10 ballistic missiles toward the East Sea just days after testing cruise missiles from a brand new warship, and that sequence of events is not random noise. It is a coordinated, deliberate military communication, and Pyongyang is speaking a language that Washington, distracted and overstretched, seems dangerously uninterested in translating right now. Let's begin with the warship because it tells you something profound about the direction Kim Jong-un has chosen. Kim supervised the launch of sea-to-surface missiles from the destroyer Choi-Hyun on March 4th, assessing the test as a core element of the new warship's capabilities, which he described as a new symbol of sea defense for his country. Now, a destroyer in itself might sound like ordinary military hardware to an American audience accustomed to aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. But this particular vessel signals something larger. North Korea launched the first-in-class Choi-Hyun on April 25th, 2025. It is the country's largest warship ever built, a 5,000-ton destroyer said to have nuclear weapons capabilities, with its cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles designed to carry nuclear warheads, and Kim did not stop there. He declared that 2 surface warships of the Choi-Hyun class or higher must be built each year, and stated that the nuclear armament of the Navy is progressing satisfactorily. Let that land for a moment. North Korea, a country that most Americans still mentally picture as economically backward and militarily primitive, is now building nuclear-capable destroyers at an industrial pace, explicitly planning to arm its navy with sea-launched nuclear weapons. This is not a desperate bluff from a cornered regime. This is a methodical, long-term military build-up by a government that has learned with absolute clarity what happens to countries that do not possess a credible nuclear deterrent. And how exactly has North Korea arrived at that lesson? Washington taught it to them again just 2 weeks ago. When the United States and Israel struck Iran on February 28th, killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the initial assault, every government on earth that exists in opposition to American power watched with a focused, cold attention. The Iran strikes, which killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, came 2 months after Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was captured in a raid by US special forces. Two governments, two leaders, both without nuclear weapons, both removed or targeted within 8 weeks. The lesson is so blunt, so geometrically clear that it barely requires analysis. North Korea's nuclear program is far more advanced than Iran's, with an estimated 50 warheads and sufficient fissile material for up to 40 more. Kim Jong-un is not building a deterrent in theory. He has one and he intends to expand it precisely because he watched what happened to those who did not. Now, here is where the geopolitical architecture of this moment becomes genuinely dangerous, and this is the part that mainstream American media is not adequately explaining to you. Both Iran and North Korea are major providers of war material to support Russia's war effort against Ukraine. For Iran, this has included missiles, drones, and ammunition. But as Iran shifts to using its materiel for its own fight, it creates a gap that the Kim regime will likely be happy to fill. In that way, the Iran-Israel-US war increases Russian dependency on North Korea, ceding additional influence and leverage to Pyongyang. Read that carefully. The same war consuming American attention and American military resources in the Middle East is simultaneously making Kim Jong-un more powerful, more indispensable, and more leveraged in the geopolitical triangle that connects Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing. The United States is not just fighting a war against Iran. It is, through the structural consequences of that war, inadvertently strengthening its most dangerous adversaries in the Pacific. And then there is the question of what is physically leaving the Korean peninsula right now, while Kim's engineers are finishing their destroyer and loading their ballistic missiles. The United States, in early March 2026, began shifting elements of its terminal high-altitude area defense system from South Korea to the Middle East as Washington adjusts regional force posture amid rising tensions tied to Iran. The THAAD system is not a minor piece of equipment. It is the crown jewel of America's missile defense architecture on the Korean Peninsula, a system specifically designed to intercept North Korean ballistic missiles in the terminal phase of their trajectory. And it is being physically removed and flown to another theater of war right now as North Korea launches 10 ballistic missiles into the sea. Moving multiple THAAD system launches out of bases in South Korea and 1/3 of the US naval surface fleet to the Middle East sends a very different message than words of reassurance. 1/3 of the US naval surface fleet. That is not a footnote. That is a strategic realignment of historic proportions happening in real time, and most Americans are not aware that it is occurring. The Trump administration has moved THAAD missile defense systems and Patriot interceptors from South Korea to the Middle East. Additionally, the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli and its Marine Expeditionary Unit stationed in Japan are also being dispatched to the region, with approximately 2,500 Marines aboard, up to 3 warships moving from the Indo-Pacific to join the 50,000 US troops already deployed in the Middle East. Let us be precise about what this means on the ground. The Marines leaving Japan represent America's most rapid reaction force in the Pacific, the troops whose presence is explicitly designed to respond to crises in Korea, Taiwan, and across the broader Indo-Pacific. They are not there anymore. They are sailing toward Iran. And South Korea, watching all of this happen, is in the deeply uncomfortable position of a country that cannot say no to its primary military guarantor. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung publicly acknowledged that while his government has expressed opposition to the possible redeployment of US air defense assets, the reality is that South Korea cannot fully impose its position on the United States. That is a remarkable admission. The leader of a sovereign nation, one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world, a country that pays enormous sums to host American troops, is standing before his cabinet and saying, essentially, we objected, but we have no real power to stop this. And while Washington is absorbed in the Middle East, and while South Korea is quietly absorbing the anxiety of watching its missile shields literally fly away, the spring 2026 drills are being used to stress test South Korea's domestic capabilities in sophisticated areas such as long-range strike, command and control, and intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. The assessments are part of the planned conditions-based transfer of wartime operational control of South Korean troops from US to South Korean command. In other words, the very exercises that North Korea is reacting to with this missile barrage are simultaneously exercises in which the United States is essentially testing whether South Korea can defend itself without American leadership. That is a profound structural shift in the alliance, and it is happening at precisely the moment when North Korea is expanding its naval nuclear capability and launching 10 ballistic missiles in a single afternoon. Now, some will ask, is Kim Jong-un genuinely threatening war, or is this political theater? And the honest answer is that the distinction may matter less than people assume. For Kim Jong-un, Trump represents a volatile double-edged sword. He remains perhaps the only American leader willing to engage in direct, unconventional diplomacy with Pyongyang. Yet he has also proven capable of authorizing ruthless and preemptive strikes against perceived adversaries, as seen in Iran and Venezuela. Iran was engaged in talks with the United States until right before the military campaign. This unpredictability, where diplomatic overtures can instantly pivot to military obliteration, has left North Korea in a strategic dilemma. By ramping up its own threats, Pyongyang may be attempting to signal that it will not share the fate of the Iranian leadership, even as it navigates the increasingly erratic and high stakes foreign policy of the second Trump term. This is not a rogue state acting irrationally. This is a government making a perfectly rational calculation under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And that calculation involves demonstrating military capability at the precise moment when its adversary is most distracted and most depleted. North Korea appears to be trying to do two things at once: condemn US military action against Iran and the joint drills with South Korea, while avoiding language that would completely shut the door on future diplomacy with Trump. That dual approach tells you that Kim Jong-un is not a man who has decided on one course. He is a man surveying his options, keeping every door open, using military demonstrations to keep pressure high, while watching to see whether Washington will find its way back to the negotiating table or continue deepening its commitment in the Middle East until the Pacific becomes, by default, a secondary theater. Kim Jong-un publicly signaled that he would be open to resuming dialogue with Washington, provided that the United States recognizes the DPRK as a nuclear weapons state and abandons its objective of denuclearization. That condition is not new, but in the context of what happened to Iran, which did not have nuclear weapons, the demand for recognition as a nuclear state carries a weight and an urgency that it did not have before. The lesson Pyongyang has taken from the past several weeks is not that negotiation is impossible. The lesson is that negotiation from a position of nuclear inferiority is suicidal. North Korean state media condemned the United States and Israel for launching a war of aggression against Iran, but did not report the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of members of Iran's top leadership. That omission was not accidental. North Korea's political system is built around the near mythic authority and invulnerability of its leader. Publicly broadcasting the violent removal of another supreme leader would introduce a dangerous precedent. It would remind North Korean citizens that even the most powerful figure in a tightly controlled state can be tracked, targeted, and eliminated. The silence of North Korean state media on Khamenei's death is one of the most revealing data points in this entire story. It tells you that Kim Jong-un is managing information internally because the information is personally threatening to him. The United States killed an Ayatollah. It captured a president in Venezuela. Kim Jong-un is watching this and doing the math, and the math leads him to the same conclusion every time. Nuclear weapons are not a bargaining chip. They are a survival mechanism, and every missile fired into the Sea of Japan is a public reminder that this survival mechanism is operational. Some analysts say North Korea may interpret the developments in mixed ways. Pyongyang could see the movement of US forces as both a potential opportunity and a warning. On one hand, North Korea may view it as a sign that US attention is shifting to another theater. On the other hand, it also demonstrates that US forces based in Korea can be deployed rapidly elsewhere, showing the flexibility and reach of American military power. Both of those interpretations are correct simultaneously, and that is precisely what makes this moment so volatile. The danger is not a single obvious act of aggression. The danger is a slow accumulation of miscalculations, each government reading ambiguous signals through the lens of its own fears and interests, until an incident happens that nobody quite intended, but that everyone's policies made inevitable. Now let's talk about what this means for the American people directly, because this is not just an abstract foreign policy puzzle. When the United States strips missile defense systems from South Korea to fight a war in the Middle East, it is making a bet. The bet is that North Korea will not exploit the gap. The bet is that Kim Jong-un, who is rational, who is expanding his navy, who is firing ballistic missiles in batches of 10, while watching American military hardware leave the peninsula, will sit quietly and wait. History offers a cautionary reminder of how signals, intentional or otherwise, can shape strategic misjudgments. In January 1950, US Secretary of State Dean Acheson outlined a Pacific defense perimeter that appeared to exclude the Korean Peninsula, a concept that became known as the Acheson Line. Although historians debate the extent of its influence, there is an enduring view that the perception of Korea being outside the US defense umbrella contributed to miscalculations ahead of the Korean War that began months later. The parallel is uncomfortable enough that serious analysts are drawing it. The question is whether the people making decisions in Washington are reading the same history. An expert from the Royal United Services Institute noted that the redeployment will feed the perception that the US is prioritizing its Middle East interests ahead of an Asian ally, adding that if Seoul earns the status of a model ally by spending more on defense and becoming self-reliant, the consequence may be that it is left more on its own. There it is, stated plainly by a think tank analyst. The logic of American strategic flexibility, the logic that says American military assets should be globally fungible and redeployable on demand, is also the logic that slowly hollows out the credibility of American security guarantees. Every ally watching the THAAD systems fly out of Osan Air Base is asking themselves, when we need them, will they be there? And that question is not just being asked in Seoul. It is being asked in Tokyo, in Taipei, in Manila. The entire architecture of American deterrence in the Pacific rests on the belief that the United States will be present when the moment arrives. The concentration of US military assets in the Middle East is forcing allies like Japan and South Korea to ask themselves hard questions about US reliability. Trump has expressed interest in resuming talks with North Korea, raising speculation about a potential meeting when he visits China from March 31st to April 2. And this is perhaps the most fascinating and disturbing subplot of the entire story. The same administration that struck Iran, that eliminated the Iranian supreme leader, that has 50,000 troops deployed in the Middle East, is also potentially flying to Asia in 2 weeks to sit down with Xi Jinping, with Kim Jong-un, possibly part of the equation. What exactly does diplomacy look like in this environment? What can Washington credibly offer a nuclear armed state that has just watched the United States prove twice in 8 weeks that diplomatic talks do not preclude sudden military action? From Pyongyang's vantage point, developments in Iran reinforce two enduring conclusions about the United States. First, that Washington's diplomatic overtures can coexist with the preparation for military action. Despite public indications that progress was being made in ongoing talks about Iran's nuclear program, the Trump administration went ahead with preemptive military strikes. Kim Jong-un is a student of American behavior, and he has taken the course. He has seen the exam questions. He knows that a handshake from Donald Trump and a polite dialogue about denuclearization can coexist with targeting coordinates being entered into a missile system. He knows because he just watched it happen to Iran. What we are witnessing today is the consequence of a foreign policy that treats the entire world as a series of separate problems to be managed one at a time. The Middle East is burning, and so attention and resources flow to the Middle East, but the Pacific does not stand still while Washington looks away. A nuclear-capable surface combatant adds another launch axis to North Korea's missile force and forces US and South Korean planners to account for mobile sea-based threats in addition to land launchers and submarines. That raises the cost of preemption, complicates intelligence and tracking, and injects uncertainty into crisis decision-making because the same destroyer can carry both conventional and nuclear-capable systems. Every week that passes without a coherent Pacific strategy is a week in which North Korea's military architecture becomes more complex, more dispersed, and more difficult to deter or to neutralize. The window of maximum American leverage over Pyongyang has not closed, but it is not standing open forever either. The deepest problem here is structural. The United States has, for decades, organized its foreign policy around the assumption that it can manage multiple theaters simultaneously, that it possesses sufficient resources, alliances, and credibility to deter adversaries in Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, and Latin America all at once. That assumption is being tested in real time right now. Continued support for Ukraine, energy, and political considerations in Venezuela, domestic polarization tied to immigration policy, upcoming midterm elections, and the prospect of prolonged instability in the Middle East all compete for attention and resources. Adding a major crisis in Northeast Asia would significantly strain US capacity and alliance management. That is the world as it actually exists in March of 2026, not the world of strategic theory, not the world of campaign speeches and policy papers, the actual world where missiles are flying into the Sea of Japan on the same Saturday that American warships are leaving Japanese ports headed for the Persian Gulf. And so when you see those 10 ballistic missiles splashing down east of the Korean Peninsula, do not process them as background noise, as the predictable theater of a hermit kingdom that always complains when America and South Korea hold exercises. Process them as a deliberate signal sent by a government that is watching, calculating, and expanding its capabilities in the space that American distraction is creating. North Korea's foreign ministry has released statements denouncing the joint US-Israeli attacks on Iran and expressing support for Tehran's new supreme leader. Pyongyang and Tehran are now ideologically aligned in open defiance of the American-led order, with Russia sitting behind both of them as a military guarantor and an economic lifeline. This is not a collection of separate crises. This is one interconnected transformation of global power, and the missiles fired near Japan yesterday are as much a part of that transformation as the bombs falling on Iranian cities. The question for the American people is not whether they care about the Korean Peninsula. The question is whether they understand that what happens there, what gets decided or not decided in the next several months, will shape the security architecture of this country and its closest allies for a generation. The attention being pulled toward the Middle East is understandable, but attention is not infinite and power is not infinite. And the countries watching America bleed its resources and credibility into one theater while pulling its defenses out of another are not sitting there hoping Washington finds its balance. They are watching for the moment when the balance tips far enough to matter,